Yesterday, Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York said the state is in need of about 30,000 ventilators. Is there any hope, in your opinion, based on what you know in terms of what's out there in the marketplace and what will be produced, that that kind of demand can be met in the near term?
Well, a number of things. First of all, we all acknowledge that this is an unprecedented human challenge that we're all facing. And it requires an unprecedented response from all of us. And I can assure you that Medtronic is mobilizing and doing everything we can. Now, to your specific point here, there's different grades of ventilators. There's the very acute ones, the ones that we make for critical care needs. And there's others which are used earlier in the progression of the disease. And overall, 30,000 is going to be a challenge. It's a matter of when. Over time, we can probably get there, but I think on that point, intelligent allocation of these devices, not only between geographies, but also within the hospital, and the right patient gets the right type of ventilator is going to be extremely important.
Yeah, so what can Medtronic do? I know that you have significantly tried to increase your ability to produce ventilators, but the numbers pale in comparison to the needs still, don't they?
Yes, they do. And like I think we mentioned, we've increased our capacity significantly. We're already doubled it and on the way to doubling it again. And so our capacity is going up. We do make these critical care ventilators, which are in very high demand. We're also opening up with other partners who've come forward. And Tesla is one that I think people have heard about, where one of our ventilators will be made by them, and they're fast on track to try to make that as well. In addition to that, we're going to open source one of our lower-end ventilators in less acute situations for others to make as quickly as they can. This product is a little more generic in form and can be probably made a little more easily than the one we make, which requires many components, and some of the components require very precise manufacturing. So that's what we're doing.
I think you mentioned...
Yes, go ahead, please.
No, I think you mentioned the partnership with Tesla. I was curious about that because Elon Musk did tweet about his conversation with you and your team. Just wondering if you could share any of that and whether Musk had any interesting sort of visionary ideas about manufacturing that could help speed up the process.
Well, they've got capabilities there, I think without going into too much detail here, one of the products that we make, it is not our prime product right now, is one that is perfectly suitable, at least in some of these instances, they will make. And they're doing that in parallel while we're focusing on the product that is our largest volume product, which is the PB980. So there's this other product which Tesla is looking at, and we will do everything we can to help them and parallel up that production. And we're looking at other partners too,
Mr. Ishrak,
who are coming in.
You mentioned that there are different grades of ventilators. What's the need for the lowest versus the highest grade? As far, what are your projections for those different types across the country?
Well, what's going to happen here is that you've got to use these intelligently. When the patients first come in to the hospital with severe conditions, actually you can use a lower grade ventilator. And then as the condition worsens, some of them recover, in which case it's okay. But as the condition worsens, you need the higher grade ventilators. And so you need fewer high grade ventilators than the lower ones, but obviously the high grade ones can cover all situations. Essentially, the way in which these patients are triaged is a known methodology that clinicians use, depending on the amount of air that's needed to be pumped into the body and the exhalation as well. There are clear metrics which are used to triage these patients. But in general, you need more of the less acute ones and fewer of the critical care ones, but obviously with the caveat that the critical care ones are the ones that's most needed when patients are in very severe condition.
Omar, do you have any idea what the actual number of ventilators available in the world is right now and what the conceivable need is going to be over the next few months?
Well, I'll give you the U.S. numbers. There are something like 60,000 ventilators in the U.S. And if you translate that across the world, rough numbers, you probably have 100 to 150,000 ventilators around the world. When you look at that, then the need is going to be extreme in a certain geography at a certain time. So the need for proper allocation And movement of these ventilators once the crisis is over in a certain place is extremely important, especially as the time horizon is shortened. We have to be realistic about how many we can make at any one given time. And so the proper allocation of these products within a country and then between countries is extremely important, and movement of them once the crisis is peaked is also extremely important. But that's the kind of range we're talking about. I mean, maybe 200,000, but that's the range we're talking about today. And we've heard, needs in just one state to be in the tens of thousands. And so we have to really mobilize ourselves to get this thing going. And I can tell you that certainly Medtronic is doing everything we possibly can. We're helping others, and there's a lot of effort going on across the industry to try to meet this demand. But the allocation process is going to be critical here.
So how do you decide that, Omar? Which states, which countries get the ventilators that are coming off of the machines, the lines that you're making?
So right now, every week we go through an acuity analysis of where the greatest need is, depending on how many patients have been diagnosed and what state they're in, and we kind of try to prioritize it that way. But we're also sort of proposing that that in the United States there's a centralized body through FEMA who can do the allocation, and then they can move these ventilators around. That would be a much more efficient process than us trying to do it. And then eventually, maybe in other countries around the world, in the EU and others, a similar kind of process can be put in place. But in the United States, FEMA, I think, is already making moves to do that. And I think that'll be very helpful. And I think the entire industry is behind them in trying to achieve that.
Can multiple people use these ventilators at one time? And if we are faced with a surge in this equipment all of a sudden, is there some way to kind of keep that in a strategic reserve for the future once we don't need that many going forward?
Well, you can certainly keep that in the strategic reserve for the future. There's no question about that. It's a question of how many, but that can certainly be kept. These ventilators, can last a long time, so that's not an issue at all. Now, can more than one person use one ventilator? That's not recommended because that reduces the amount of available pressure, but it also says that two people require the settings in the machine to be exactly the same, and that's not going to be a common sort of phenomena. And so that is not recommended by our clinical people. I mean, in an emergency, if there's nothing else available, I mean, people have to make their choices, but that is certainly not a recommended practice by the clinical community.
What about the Defense Production Act? Is the president using this for these critical supplies? Should he be using this more?
No, I think, look, these are global manufacturers. I mean, we make ours in Ireland. They're global suppliers. I think this is more a matter of allocation at the central level, which is what is important. I think for this purpose, we've got to make sure that there's flow of material across the world, and anything that detracts that will actually create a problem. What is really important, and I keep emphasizing, is the intelligent allocation, and that really FEMA is taking the lead in that, and we support that, and the quicker that gets in place, it's never going to be completely perfect, but they can do a pretty good job by using their clinical support as well and move these things around and optimize what we have, while the manufacturer is trying to ramp up production as fast as we possibly can from as many sources as we possibly can. So that's the strategy
right.
that I think we're following. Yes.
And understanding that, the efforts you're making and manufacturers around the world, nonetheless, I don't know if he's begun his daily press conference yet, but my guess is Governor Cuomo of New York is going to once again be begging for ventilators that don't seem to be there and may not be there. Isn't that right, Omar, until perhaps June? I mean, that is what New York and other states that are facing this kind of crisis are really dealing with, isn't it?
I mean, that's true. I mean, to be realistic, getting 30,000 ventilators overnight into New York is not going to be that simple. But at the same time, we'll try to get as many as possible, and triaging the patients to the appropriate ventilator and moving the ventilators around is really the only option we have. And so we should focus on that, follow the certain guidelines, work with the clinicians to do that. We're fully prepared to put in training resources, other support resources through our employees as we see fit. So I do emphasize that the proper allocation and movement, the proper triaging of patients to the right ventilator at the right time is extremely important. And whatever support that we can provide in that area, we will absolutely do. But just being realistic about it through looking at the sheer numbers, getting to that kind of number immediately is going to be a real challenge. And so this triaging is extremely important.